Good morning and welcome. Excuse me. I'm Nancy Davenport and I'm the University Librarian. On behalf of all of my colleagues, I'd like to welcome you to the first of our social justice lecture series this year. They're saying they can't hear me. Is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah? Can you hear me in the back?
Louder.
Louder. Okay, so it's both. It's both. Shall I start again? Welcome. We're very pleased to see all of you here today for the first in our social justice lecture series of this season. We have been doing this series for about 3 years now, and having faculty members come, community members, and students come really enlivens the conversation. And we are delighted that you are with us this morning and hope that you'll stay to have a light lunch with us afterwards. Let me introduce the speaker to you. Monica Hopkins Maxwell is the executive director of the ACLU in the nation's capital, and she's had this job since 2004. Prior to that, she served as the executive director of the ACLU in Idaho from 2008, over which time she saw sweeping statewide victories, particularly in the areas of criminal justice reform, LGBTQI equality, immigrants' rights, and upholding the First Amendment. Prior to joining ACLU, she had a distinguished career in the nonprofit sector, which included both executive and development positions. She currently serves as the vice president of the board for the Story District, a DC-based storytelling organization, and as a board member for the National Reentry Network for Returning Citizens. She previously served on the advisory board for Boise State University's College of Social Sciences and Public Affairs. And in 2008, she was a Rotary Group Study Exchange participant in Sri Lanka. And in 2012 to 13 was a Rockwood Leadership Institute Fellow for LGBTQ advocacy. We're delighted she's with us today, and she'll tell you whether or not to hold your questions or to ask them as she goes through. Monica, welcome to AU.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? No. I think my mic's not on. Is it on? No one can hear me. Can you hear if I use this?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's use this. Keep it on. Okay. So thank you so much for having me today. This is actually one of my favorite subjects to talk about. And in the ACLU's work, we often find ourselves saying, this is so horrible, but we can do so much to change it. So a little bit first about the ACLU. The ACLU has had the same mission for almost 100 years, which is basically to preserve, protect, defend, and advance the individual rights and liberties contained within the Constitution and Bill of Rights. And Roger Baldwin, our founder, knew that we as a public needed to stand up for those rights and the ideals that are enshrined in our Constitution. The ACLU of the nation's capital is the ACLU in the District of Columbia. We deal with issues arising within the District of Columbia. We were founded in 1920 as a response to the Palmer raids. Here in the district, we were founded in 1961, this chapter. There are 53 chapters of the ACLU across the United States, and you might be saying, well, there are only 50 states. California is very big. We actually have 3 chapters in California. We have one in DC. We also have one in Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico is very much like DC, where they are a stronghold of the US government, but basically a colony. We have 3,000 members across the district, and we do our work. People know the ACLU mostly because we sue people. It's something we do very well. We have represented clients more than any other non-governmental organization in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. The only agency that has been in front of the Supreme Court more than the ACLU is the federal government. So, but we also work on what we would call kind of front-end issues as well. We work legislatively in municipalities, in state legislatures, and in Congress, doing legislative and lobby work. And then really, really front-end work doing public education, so teaching people know your rights, presentations so they can stand up for their rights themselves, going in and helping organize or providing assistance to organizations and people who want to do that organization themselves, providing legal observers, those sorts of things. But we're here today to talk about our criminal injustice system. And over the last few years, I've kind of changed my rhetoric from saying this criminal justice system to criminal injustice system. We have, over the last 40 plus years, really created a criminal injustice system with the war on drugs that essentially has become a war on Black communities. We have created a war on terror that has given rise to racial profiling of Muslim and Arab communities. We have created a criminal injustice system with housing not only immigrants who are fleeing persecution, but housing entire families and then making the children, some as young as 4 years old, represent themselves in immigration court. So as we talk about the racial disparities in the system, I'm actually going to pull this up. Just a definition. So racial disparity in the justice system exists when the proportion of a racial or ethnic group within control of the system differs from the proportion of such groups in the general population. So that gives you kind of the context of what we're talking about. In order to talk about the criminal injustice system, we have to talk about it systemically. And we have to kind of know our history. And so when we're talking about a justice system and our Constitution, when our Constitution was written, it was written by white, wealthy, land-owning males. So there's a large proportion of folks, probably in this room, that these ideals weren't necessarily written for. And we have to kind of front that and acknowledge that. We also have to acknowledge that when the Constitution was written, when we are talking specifically, and we'll talk a lot about the effects of the criminal justice system on Black communities, Black communities were not seen as whole people. Black people were not seen as whole people, they were seen as chattel. And we have to acknowledge that as well. And so what we're trying to hold up when we make change, when we make systemic change, is holding up the ideals that are actually in our founding document for all people. So we're going to talk about the criminal justice pipeline, and I kind of like looking at the entire pipeline. It's very easy to focus on mass incarceration without focusing on how all of these things fit together in a very systemic way to create racial inequality and systemic problems. So I'm not sure. There is such a huge dialogue going on about policing in this country, and this morning when I opened up my news feed, something remarkable actually happened. An Ohio police chief actually condemned the Tulsa officer's shooting. And that is something I think that we have been waiting for. is for police to actually stand up and indicate that change actually needs to happen, that this is a systemic problem in our country. So the ACLU works on policing. We work on excessive force issues. We work on corruption. We work on asset forfeiture, militarization, and search and seizure. Racial profiling affects a wide array of communities of color. More than 240 years of slavery and 90 years of legalized racial segregation have led to systemic profiling of blacks in traffic and in pedestrian stops. Since September 11th, 2001, members of the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities have been profiled by airline personnel, federal law enforcement, and local police. We talked about the federal government's encouragement of unprecedented raids in immigrant communities and workplaces that have targeted Latino communities in particular. And these policies have unjustly expanded the purview of the police, have also undermined basic trust in the police, and created an atmosphere of fear. We do this mostly under the guise of public safety, what we call public safety. And studies have shown that communities don't react to police the same way. Whether you feel safe, actually safe when you feel a police officer or not, whether you feel safe sitting in your car just reading a book, which we know in the past few days has gotten someone killed. So policing in and of itself for racial minorities and communities is complex, because in some communities we hear that they want police in their communities to stop violent crimes, to actually do the policing that they're supposed to do, but they are reticent to actually call the police at all because of how policing has been enacted in communities of color. In the District of Columbia, we have been working on policing reform, and just as a snapshot, I went back, and the more things change, the more things stay the same. We live in an era of technology and social media, and so partly the question has to be raised is, is this an increase in police violence, or is it simply being shown over and over and over again and being dragged into the light by people with cell phones and cameras, where we can see immediately what is going on? Here in the District of Columbia, we sued the Metro Transit Police, one of the times we've sued the Metro Transit Police. This case was called Winslow versus Taylor, and there was a 14-year-old girl who was traveling home on the Metro. When she was traveling home on the Metro, she was out past curfew, which DC law actually indicates that you can do that if you are traveling home. She was pulled off of the Metro. She was handcuffed. She was taken by her hands and lifted off the ground, taken to a bus stop. And when she moved her arms and stood up because it was uncomfortable, the Metro Transit police officer took her head and bashed it into the side of the bus stop that she was sitting at. And then when she bit him, because he was continuing to beat her head, he punched her and then charged her with assault on a police officer. So we sued and we won. We do impact litigation that aims for systemic change. We got an auditor to come in and review all the policies and do retrainings with the police officers, and got damages for our client, who has has a bit of brain damage now from the assault from the police officer when she was just traveling home from seeing a movie. There was a 5-month study done actually by WAMU and the investigative reporting workshop here at American University, and it was co-produced by Reveal, and they analyzed about 2,000 cases of charges of assault on a police officer. 90% of those charged with what is known as APO, or assault on a police officer, in DC were Black, even though the population in DC is now at about 50%. Significantly more medical attention was required for those accused of APO than that required for the police officer victims. Nearly 2/3 of those charged with APO were not charged with any other crime except for the APO, which calls into question whether officers had the requisite legal justification to approach the person in the first place. These results have raised concern about the use or overuse of the charge to hide things like excessive force. And it fails to account for the fact that the power dynamic between police officers and individuals just on the street, not only for APO, but officers walking up to individuals who are just hanging out on the street and then saying, well, can you empty your pockets for me, with no legal justification. This is one of the things that we found out when we actually did our marijuana in black and white report in 2013. And what we found is we actually had some great data students, if you want to do data for social justice work, some great data students, and we pulled the arrest records for marijuana, and we geoplotted them on a map. And if you look at the map that's on our website, there actually is a split about at 16th Street. And you find the majority of marijuana arrests are on the east of 16th Street, with a smattering on the west, even though rates of marijuana use between Black communities and white communities is essentially the same. This is one of those areas where we found this out by going and doing Know Your Rights presentations with high school students. And young Black men kept saying the same thing over and over and over again. They kept saying, well, what do you mean a police officer can't just stop me and ask me to empty my pockets? I said they can't. They have to have a reasonable justification for stopping you in the first place. So officers are using these stop and contacts to actually find paraphernalia, find marijuana, and they were using the supposed smell of marijuana in order to do that. We decriminalized marijuana in the district, and then right before legalization of marijuana, no longer in the District of Columbia can officers use the smell of marijuana to stop folks on the street. So sentencing. Excessive sentencing, mandatory minimums, and what we call LWOP, or life without parole. Those are the three things about sentencing that I want to kind of focus on here. And in this photo, it actually shows you, this is life without prison, the 5 craziest reasons you can get sentenced to life in prison. And this is a report that the ACLU did in 2014. And these are actual cases. Taking an abusive stepfather's gun away from your shared home, stealing 3 belts from a store, possessing stolen scrap metal, shoplifting 2 jerseys, and siphoning gas from a truck, stealing gas from someone's truck, can get you, in some jurisdictions, life without parole. So the racial disparities that are present in sentencing laws, the ACLU worked incredibly hard on the crack cocaine disparity. So if you were convicted of crack use or having crack, you would get a sentence 100 times that for powder cocaine. Essentially the same substance, but the deep analysis, and I probably don't have to do a whole lot of that for people in the room, is the end user. Crack cocaine was cheap. Crack cocaine proliferated in black communities. Powder cocaine was expensive. Powder cocaine proliferates in white communities. That disparity shows this kind of systematic disparity that happens in the criminal justice system, along with mandatory minimums for lots of things that tie and hamstring judges' hands to actually use their discretion and take multiple factors into context of what should actually happen to a defendant. So this is drug law. We've been working very hard on drug law, but mandatory minimums across the board. We have mandatory minimums for crimes. We have mandatory minimums, the 3 strikes law. All of these things over 40 years of being tough on crime, which we know doesn't work. We should be smart on crime. But these federal mandatory minimums have resulted in people of color accounting for 43% of the total executions and 55% of those currently awaiting execution, because it falls down in the criminal justice system and sentencing all the way to the death penalty. And the death penalty, you are more likely to get the death penalty if it is a violent crime resulting in death where the victim is white and you are black. So the disparities in the system, and I'm just going to hopefully, but I can't find my mouse now. Well, life without parole. So there is a, oh, it's not showing on my screen. So the ACLU.
Can you imagine a mother without her oldest child? It'd be different if I knew my child.
Can everyone hear that?
was deceased.
No.
I could accept that. It would hurt. But that's a part of life. But to take him like they did and to throw him away, oh no.
Okay.
He's my son.
So
I have my little brother anymore. That was my son.
the ACLU has worked really hard on life without parole. The video that doesn't have any sound that you can hear are families and that highlight those 5 kind of reasons that you can get life without parole. They were actually ACLU clients that told their stories in a video about the fact that life without parole is essentially a living death for folks. And when we look at the disparities in sentencing, we want a just system. We want a system where the punishment should fit the crime. And what we are finding is because of the 40 years of the war on drugs and this tough on crime kind of approach, people get longer and longer sentences. And many folks who had gotten long sentences or life without parole were also juveniles. And juveniles were sentenced when they were juveniles. And as Bryan Stevenson, who, if you have not read Just Mercy, everyone a few years ago everyone was reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. If you haven't read that, I highly suggest that. But Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy is worth a read. And when I heard Bryan Stevenson talk, he said, no one should be condemned for life for something that happened, a bad thing that they did on the worst day of their life. That's not to say that there aren't people who that may be a very correct sentence, but the use of life without parole is actually out of control. So incarceration, this is an art installation that was done to illustrate the amount of money that we are putting into our criminal justice system. So in California alone, since 1980, they've built 22 prisons and 1 university. The Vera Institute has done a report that came out last year. We've focused a lot on prisons, and the Vera report went a little bit lower and went down to jails and the difference between a prison and a jail, and said jails have now become warehouses for the mentally afflicted, for the poor, and for folks who actually need substance abuse treatment. And if you look at state budgets, what has happened over time is we cut funding to these wraparound services that people actually need, and our response has been to criminalize that behavior. Now, if someone is an alcoholic, we don't put them in jail. We get them services, we get them help. And instead, what we have done in this country has really focused on criminalizing a whole host of behaviors, not only that need to be dealt with by other services, but behaviors that are natural human behaviors. Loitering laws are a great example of this that also feed into creating a system with racial disparities. Loitering is something lots of folks do in communities to hang out on their front porches. It's unconstitutional. The ACLU here in DC sued over loitering laws. So incarceration, we have built a system where we spend $80 billion on incarceration every year. This is the growth from 1970 to 2013. And 10 is the number that Black Americans are incarcerated for drug offenses at a rate 10 times greater than that of whites, despite the fact that blacks and whites use drugs at roughly the same rate. This tough on crime politics fueled this explosion of incarceration rates, and at the close of 2010, America had 1.3 million people behind bars in state prisons, 775,000 in local jails, 217,000 in federal facilities, and that adds up to more than 2.2 million people locked in cages. We believe that this is a critical moment in time to address our addiction to incarceration in this country. The ACLU does believe that we can actually cut incarceration rates in this country in half by 2020. And we can do that across the country, like California has done, by lowering some of the penalties for that rise to felonies, making them misdemeanors, making some of those misdemeanors citations, because that tough on crime model that put those sentences in place don't work anymore. Here in the district, if we want to talk about our incarceration, and in fact, if we want to talk about our criminal justice system, it's incredibly different, and people don't seem to know about it. So we don't have control over our criminal justice system in the District of Columbia. If you are charged with a crime that carries a potential sentence that would equal a felony, that would be 6 months or longer, you are prosecuted by the U.S. attorney. And then you are sent to a federal prison. So we don't have complete control over our criminal justice system. And reform in DC may look a little bit different than in other jurisdictions where they want to close facilities. We want to bring people back home. And now is a critical juncture in the District of Columbia because the government has just allocated $5 million to look at building a new jail. So now here in the District of Columbia, it's a critical moment to really ask the difficult questions about what size jail do we need? Why are we incarcerating people? What is it that people need so they're not offending in the first place or they don't return again? And then from that data, really asking what size jail do we need here in the district and how do we approach crime? So the racial disparities of imprisonment, at the rate that we are going, we know that 1 in 3 Black men may be incarcerated in their lifetime. 1 in 18 Black women, 1 in 45 Latina women, as opposed to 1 in 17 white men and 1 in 111 white women. According to Unlocking America, if African American and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rates as white Americans, prison and jail populations would decline by approximately 50%. And then finally, reentry programs. So if we're going to talk about the entire kind of pipeline from upstream about how we police communities and which communities get policed, and then sentencing, and then actually incarceration, we can't stop there. We actually have to talk about what happens to people once we tag them with a criminal record for something perhaps as simple as low-level, nonviolent crimes that then end up barring them from housing or living in certain neighborhoods or employment. And that 95% number up there is the percentage of people that will get out of jail or prison. 95%. In this country, we think about locking people away and immediately think that they are bad, horrible people, and we put them out of sight. 95% of these individuals, these human beings that we have caged for a bad action on the worst day of their life will get back out into our communities. How have we rehabilitated them? How have we accepted them back into our communities? How have we let them live past their charge is very important. Here in the District of Columbia, we have banned the box for employment. So if you have ever filled out an employment application and it asks you, have you ever committed a felony or misdemeanor? We've banned that in housing. We've banned that in employment. Currently, in front of the DC Council is ban the box for housing. So there was a public hearing before they went on recess, and hopefully they will pass it before the session ends in December. Because when we look at people, the racial disparities can be ended at this other end too, at this back end of the criminal and justice system. Because of one's minority status and being tagged with a charge, gaining access to a job, housing, education, and healthcare opportunities is much more difficult for people of color. That criminal justice record aggravates these difficulties and places the individual at a heightened likelihood of recidivating. And so when people say a lot of times, well, they're just kind of repeat offenders, this is a revolving door, we have to ask ourselves, as a society and as a community, what is happening here that doesn't allow someone to fully reintegrate into our communities? So I want to kind of end with this, and then I'm happy to entertain all sorts of questions. There is this narrative that sometimes goes on that the disproportionate incarceration of Black people is not the result of systemic racism, but rather of shortcomings within the Black community. Well, Black people must just commit more crime. And I would posit this injustice system has set up systemic racism from the very beginning as to how we apply our laws in three kind of distinct areas. If a Black person and a white person each commit a crime, the Black person is more likely to be arrested, due in part to the fact that Black people are more heavily policed. It just follows through to the logical conclusion that if you have more police in areas with more policing, stopping people for no reason, you are going to end up with higher rates of incarceration. Number two, when Black people are arrested for a crime, they are convicted more often than white people arrested for the same crime. So if you have someone who has a low level of marijuana on them, if they're Black, they're much more likely to be arrested than if they're white, they might get off with warning. And then finally, when Black people are convicted of a crime, they are more likely to be sentenced to incarceration compared to whites convicted of the same crime as well. That's why in the District of Columbia, we have 98% of our jail population is Black. The population of DC is somewhere at about the 50-50 mark. So recently, to illustrate kind of this point and the systemic kind of racism within the system, Judge Sonia Sotomayor actually wrote an amazing dissent in Utah versus Strieff, a Supreme Court case that had to do with the Fourth Amendment. And so the facts were this. A Salt Lake City cop was watching a home rumored to house methamphetamine dealers. When Edward Joseph Strieff left the house, the cop stopped him, questioned him, and checked his record. When the cop found a warrant for an unpaid parking ticket, he searched Strieff, found meth in his pockets, and arrested him for possession of drugs. In Strieff and the other cases leading up to it, the Supreme Court has now decreed that evidence gathered in an illegal search isn't the fruit of the poison tree, which is a legal argument, as Justice Felix Frankfurter put it in 1939, and so must not be suppressed. Even though gathered illegally, that evidence, the meth in his pocket, can be used at trial against the defendant for that charge. Sonia Sotomayor, it's worth reading. It's worth going and finding her dissent. She invoked James Baldwin. She invoked W.E.B. Du Bois. She invoked Ta-Nehisi Coates and Michelle Alexander. And she wrote, quote, "The court today holds that the discovery of a warrant for an unpaid parking ticket will forgive a police officer's violation of your Fourth Amendment rights. Do not be soothed by the opinion's technical language. This case allows the police to stop you on the street, demand your identification, and check it for outstanding traffic warrants, even if you are doing nothing wrong. If the officer discovers a warrant for fine you forgot to pay, courts will now excuse his illegal stop and will admit into evidence anything he happens to find by searching you after arresting you on the warrant, because the Fourth Amendment should prohibit, not permit, such conduct. I dissent. And she concluded, this case tells everyone, white and black, guilty and innocent, that an officer can verify your legal status at any time. It says that your body is subject to invasion while courts excuse the violation of your rights. It implies that you are not a citizen of democracy, but the subject of a carceral state, just waiting to be cataloged. We must not pretend that the countless people who are routinely targeted by police are isolated. They are canaries in the coal mine whose deaths, civil and literal, warn us that no one can breathe in this atmosphere. It's a heavy, heavy subject with lots and lots of work to do, but it is an incredible moment and opportunity in this nation to front the conversation with race and what we have done by creating a criminal injustice system. Thank you. So there are microphones going around. If folks have questions, you can feel free to raise your hand. We're recording, so please do use a microphone.
Good morning. You clearly put the emphasis on race, which historically is correct. But is it fair not also to include poverty? Because you find that people who tend to go through the criminal system is a prototype. Tend to be poor, they tend to be less educated, dysfunctional families, lack of mentors. And that's who you see coming into the system. So when you say 98% of the people in the DC jail system are African American, what's the percentage who fall in that category? Because historically in this country, that part of our population tends to engage in antisocial activity, which finds them in the criminal system.
So I feel like there's two parts to kind of this question. So the actual second part of that question, I mean, I think that I would probably not catalog most people as engaging in antisocial behavior that gets them into trouble. Loitering is a perfect example of, it's very social behavior of folks that had gotten people arrested. So I don't want to kind of catalog, like I had said, that this is an error with communities. However, the first part of that question is incredibly relevant, and this is kind of the intersectionality approach. I was asked to talk about the racial disparities in the criminal justice system, so that was kind of the focus, but I think you're absolutely correct. This intersection of educational opportunity, poverty, all of those different things that go into what makes people come into contact with the criminal justice system is a deep part of it, and especially in places where you have less racial diversity, you see that jails and prisons are filled with poor white people.
By the way, I don't think it's fair to say that our DC jail system is filled with people charged with loitering. That's not the case.
I don't believe that I did say that.
Antisocial, I meant criminal. I just wanted to soften the term rather than using criminal.
Well, but I think that we have to look at what that criminal behavior was and why we are incarcerating people for that criminal behavior, and does it make sense to incarcerate? So for example, parking fines and fees, not paying court costs, have gotten people longer incarceration rates where they stay in. Their legal fines and obligations. And what good does that do us as a society? If the goal, we have to ask ourselves kind of 3 questions here, right? Like, what is the behavior that we want to change? And then, will our action, will charging a criminal charge and incarcerating that person for X period of time result in changing that behavior? And then, what are all the collateral consequences that come from that? So, for example, in some jurisdictions, laws are on the books that if you don't pay child support, they'll revoke your driver's license. How are you supposed to pay child support if you can't drive to work? This sort of, the entire criminal justice system, incarceration being one piece of it, is important to look at through the entire system.
Can you talk a little more about the ban the box? I mean, it seems to me the ideal would be to expunge records after a certain period of time. Ban the box is a step in that direction, but how banned is the box? I mean, how long how does that work, I guess I'm asking?
So ban the box legislation is a national kind of push to take that question off applications at the front end. So it's not that the employer could not ask that at the final stages and then make that decision, but it gets people over that first initial, oh, you checked the box, we're going to put it, in this pile. Now, that's not to say that that whole system runs perfectly now. I think we've implemented it for 2 years here in the district, since 2014, if I'm not mistaken. But the same thing goes with housing. It's like, well, you might be able to find a job, but if you can't find housing, which in the District of Columbia is difficult anyway.
What is the chance of moving toward expungement after a period free of crime or free of arrests? I mean, it seems to me that would be the best second chance, would be to say, I had an arrest, I paid my dues, my debt, and now I have a clean record. Is there any legal momentum to search for expungement?
Absolutely. There are criminal defense attorneys, public defenders, the ACLU, that fight for not only expungement, but sealing as well. So record sealing for periods of time. I think, this is the hard sell for the general public, and what we have to ask ourselves as human beings and community members, because we've also created this desire to know. And how many of you have watched Law and Order? Any of them, right? Law and Order goes, there's 2 parts to the justice system. The people who commit crimes and the people who catch them, right? Like, well, hang on a second. Like, we have this legal principle in this country that you are innocent until proven guilty. And yet we have, not here in the district, but in other jurisdictions, people's mugshots get placed up on, even before they're charged. People get onto sex offender registries when sex offender laws are widely vast on what you can be charged with a sex offense for. And once you're on that list, it's very difficult to get off. So I think in the expungement kind of realm, it's really balancing and educating people as to the harms that are done to communities, and balancing that with, do you really need to know someone's history? Why do you need to know this?
How do you feel the school to prison pipeline kind of plays into all of the issues going on with the criminal justice system?
I could do like a 2-hour presentation on the school to prison pipeline. So zero tolerance policies in schools, SROs, which are this really nice name, school resource officers. I'm like, oh, do they get our gym balls for us? They're police officers. And what we have done is created in schools a microcosm of policing and sentencing and incarceration for students that starts really young. Well, let's get you into the pipeline immediately. Things that used to be disciplinary issues are now offenses that will get someone a record. I think that those zero tolerance policies, we have seen more and more in the district specifically. We're interested in the use of 911 calls. There are lots of altercations and things that may happen on school grounds that either has come to our attention that either administrators or community members who may live across the street from a school or down the street and they see something happening on the school and they'll call 911. And so it's not just the SRO that gets involved, it's now a beat cop that gets involved, and something that probably could have been de-escalated and taken care of is now escalated into something. And one of the fastest growing juvenile populations in the United States is Black girls.
I think I've got the next question here. I'm an academic, so I'm going to apologize for being a little long with today. Can we rewind a couple slides to the one with the escalation beginning in 7.3? So at the tail end of that, there is a genuine decline, or is it genuine, I suppose, is the tenor of the question. There are contending opinions within academic criminology as to whether or not this is going to be a sustained effort that would get us to that endpoint, that ambitious endpoint. We talk about having this, putting this in half by 2020. Some of the pessimists are pointing out that maybe what needs to happen here is you need to strip the legal regime because the funding is kind of curious in terms of how it's allocated. If you look at, for instance, Police Officers Union, or the best book on this is by Joshua Page, the toughest beat, that talked about the California Association of Prison Officers. We went out and lobbied for the continuation of drug laws and things of that nature. So is that how it's going to happen? Or is it going to be we scale back the money that's allocated to criminal justice officials that gets us to that point?
So the way I would phrase it is a few ways: transparency, accountability, and community control. And so, for example, I don't think that it's just kind of, we do have, like in California, the unions lobbying and doing all of those other things. We also have the influx of technology into police departments that nobody knows about. Now, and the technology is expensive, first of all, and additionally, no one knows that they're using it. So how many people have heard about stingrays? Oh, nice. Yeah, that's about. So Stingray technology is essentially your phone, whenever you are somewhere, looks for the closest cell tower. Stingray technology in police departments, and we know MPD is using it because we filed an amicus brief in a case where they did use it. So Stingray technology is technology that police officers can use that shuts down essentially the cell tower, and you're now connecting to MPD as if they were the cell tower. And they can locate you through your GPS. They can look and see what is going on with your phone. It blocks all calls going out because it's not a real cell tower. So if they're using it in an area and someone needs to call 911, it's blocked. So we know that they're using these technologies, and to your point, this afternoon, actually, you'll be the first to know. This afternoon, actually, the ACLU, along with 17 partner organizations and groups, are kind of unrolling this police surveillance technology bills in jurisdictions including a conversation starting here in DC that allows the community to really engage and taxpayers to know what they're paying for, what police are using that technology for, requires a civil rights impact study. So for a lot of things like planes, we do environmental impact studies. We want police to actually be accountable to the communities they serve and think critically through the ways that that technology could be abused and say what they are going to do to mitigate that. And nothing would be grandfathered. So we want to know. And I do think, I mean, I don't know that completely dismantling or defunding the entire system, but we are working across the entire system to kind of bring those numbers down and seeing where we can get more transparency and accountability. It is not, we move towards decarceration with the full knowledge that we could have a criminal justice system that really incarcerates the folks that need to be incarcerated.
I actually wanted to touch a little bit more about expungement as far as employment is concerned. I actually spoke with an individual recently, and he stated that I believe it was maybe 10 years ago, he was arrested for something that he didn't do, but ultimately the person, that brought the charges up as a candidate statement and everything like that, and he stated to me that like if he applies for a job sometimes, it'll say not only like, as far as like the box, have you ever been convicted? Obviously the answer is no, but then it would go further and ask include anything, whether it's been expunged or anything, et cetera. Like, how do you feel about that? And what are the prospects as far as maybe getting that changed?
I didn't think about that second box. So this now gives me something to think about and maybe work on. I mean, I would put it in the same bucket as ban the box. I mean, if that is still actually on job applications, they're not asking you about the felony, but they're asking you about expungements. I think that's a loophole that we need to close. Not that, when you get to the final stages, someone couldn't ask, but then you actually have an opportunity to explain in detail kind of what happened. So I'm actually, thank you for bringing that up because I'm filing it away. I'm going to check on that.
First of all, I just want to say thanks for coming in and having this type of a conversation. I think this is great. So I'm when you start to talk about the criminal justice system, I'm a firm believer that if you do the crime, you do the time, right? Mm-hmm. So I completely agree with a large part of your sentiments that you mentioned here. When you look at things like the war on drugs, we know that a large part of that was garbage and was propaganda to really galvanize a lot of people to see certain people a certain way and to subsequently police as well a certain way. Another thing, I always say that if it was a real war on drugs, we would go to the college campuses and start, opening up drawers and seeing what's happening. I work here at American University. I'm the assistant dean of students, and so I get access to all of the care reports. The vast majority of the information is happening on campus. And if there was a real, war on getting this stuff off the streets, I can assure you that that's one of the first places that that will be checked first. Additionally, when I look at just the criminal justice system in general, I mean, I don't know how much folks have been paying attention over the last couple of months. I've been seeing there's been multiple white men who have raped and have not, and the judge has said, well, we don't want to put you in jail with the real criminals. Those people. We don't want to put you in jail with the real criminals because that would be too impactful on your future. And so I think you can potentially be rehabilitated, so I'm not going to put you in there. So I guess my thing is, and I'm not even going to get into the police brutality. You mentioned the disproportionate stops for use of the same, at the same rates. But I guess my question is, how do we start to hold people accountable? Like how does the average person who wants to be an advocate, whether it's black or white, who notices things that are disproportionate, how do they begin to start the conversations, to meet with their local, elected representatives to really say, hey, enough's enough. we notice what's happening, we're gonna hold people accountable when we want some changes.
There are lots of things that people can do. And to your point, our marijuana report, we also noted that most of the universities are on the west side of 16th Street. What can people do? Here in the district, we have a unique opportunity because not only do we only have 13 council members, that is in contrast to in state legislatures, you may be trying to lobby 120 plus people, 240 people. We have 13 council members. Additionally, we're for statehood and full voting rights as the ACLU, but one of the things, since Congress still does have oversight of our budget, we have an opportunity to pass really progressive criminal justice laws that actually elevate things to the national conversation here in the district because Congress has oversight of our budget. I think there's a much more kind of fundamental, rather than suing people and lobbying, I think that we have to be brave enough to have conversations, true, honest conversations about race. We have to be uncomfortable. We have to listen. We, and I say we as a white cisgender woman, we have to let people be angry. And we have to know that we are going to, we're going to mess up. And we have to be okay with kind of messing up as long as we're trying. And I think that the time has come to have those really hard conversations. And then the accountability piece is the lobbying, is demanding, right now they're demanding criminal charges for the Tulsa, Oklahoma police officer. I think these things have to be dragged out into the light.
So can you talk a little bit more specifically about the role that ACLU played in the decriminalization of marijuana use in the district?
Yeah, so kind of the timeline of that, we don't know that things are happening unless people tell us. So, and what we're looking for, because we work, we're not like a typical law firm or a typical lobbying firm. We're looking for impact cases or impact litigation or lobbying that would change kind of the systemic approach. So when we went and did those Know Your Rights presentations, what we were looking for is kind of these patterns. And what we saw were young black men telling us about police stopping them, and then they would stop them, and then they would ask them to empty their pockets, and then they might find something, or they might not find something, but they might get charged for something else. And so we actually FOIA'd arrest records over a 2-year period of time. We authored a report that is on our website and put up that geospatial map on our website called Marijuana in Black and White that was DC specific. Then we started talking to council members and talking about what we had found. Then we also started talking to black ministers. There are 9 black ministers in the District of Columbia who we went and talked to them, and we talked to their congregations because, people knew that marijuana is this bad thing. And I think those ministers did something that for us was ultimately ACLU. They stood up and supported marijuana decriminalization, and they stood up and supported marijuana legalization, not because it was about marijuana, and it wasn't about marijuana for the ACLU either. This is a racial justice issue. And when a law is disproportionately applied to the black community, we need to undo it. And so that was kind of our participation in that. And then, of course, the ballot passed at 71%, and Congress stripped the funding. To implement a true justice reinvestment is what it would have been for a tax and regulate system that would actually put money back into the communities that were decimated by the war on drugs here in the District of Columbia.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'd like to ask, it's really demographic is up there right now. It's the prison population started to decline around 2007, 2008, and I was wondering if that was a result of like economic conditions or policy, and if it was like economic conditions, like why did it decrease because of that? Or was policy, what policies were helpful in helping cause the decrease?
So 2008, 2009, the economic argument brought different people to the table. And essentially, the economic argument brought Republicans to the table. And they started wanting the same things for different reasons. It's incredibly expensive to incarcerate someone over a year versus alternatives to incarceration. And so even before 2008, 2009, we saw the increase in some of the alternative courts systems. We saw more emphasis on diversion programs. We actually had the Pew Center on the States and the Council on State Governments went into states and started doing justice reinvestment, which justice reinvestment at its greatest actually does what it's supposed to, which is go in, look at the inadequacies in the system, and then when you find cost savings, actually what you're supposed to do is put the money back into the communities that have been decimated. Now that hasn't really happened, but what we saw instead is that states really focused not on the entire system, but really on recidivism rates. And so started taking some of that down. But then what we have seen and what we're worried about, even in the reduction of numbers that are incarcerated, is there may be a shift to the number of people who are still under correctional control. So anytime we get a civil rights or civil liberties win, we look to see where the stream will shift next.
Monica, we're going to take 2 more questions.
Okay.
And then we'll be here. Lunch, I like lunches available. To be able to say again? Sorry, just snacks. And lunch. But we have 2 more questions out there for you.
In the District of Columbia, they offer the PIMS program, JDP, and mental health court, which is pretty different from other cities. Even though some people wind up in these programs on trumped up charges and heavily involved with area agencies, have you found that those programs offer any difference in the conviction rate or people that remain monitored over the course of time?
Yeah, so the alternative court system, I would say, I was having a conversation earlier, there are things that the District of Columbia does actually really well. We have a model public defender system. People come from other places to actually look at what we're doing. The alternative court systems is an example. Some of the juvenile justice system changes that we've made here in the district are great. So the court system itself, those alternative court systems, and I'm pulling this data from the top of my head, so academics in the room don't quote me on this, but when you use those alternative court systems, you see recidivism rates drop from about 61% to something like 16%, because you're getting someone who is monitored through the court system, but they're also getting the services that they need in order to stay clean, in order to get their mental health taken care of. The veterans courts are a great kind of addition. So they do work, but as you mentioned, we want to kind of look upstream too to make sure that we're not funneling people into a court system who never even need that court system in the first place.
With the criminal and justice system in race, You mentioned the African American and Latino community, but how about the Native American community? What do you guys plan on doing and then targeting incarceration rates and with the Native American population?
So in places where there are large Native American populations, ACLUs, so for example, the ACLU of Montana has a specific racial justice Native American program to look at the intersection that happens both on what is federal land and then what happens actually on the sovereign nation of Indian land. So that's outside of my wheelhouse because our affiliate doesn't really work on it, but I can say that in the Dakotas, in Montana, in places in the Pacific Northwest, they are looking at that racial intersection with the criminal justice system.
Monica, I'm going to ask the last question, which is on behalf of everybody here, and that is, are there roles that the students can play? Do you take interns? You had mentioned before you were looking for data analysts. What other roles might we help you with?
So there are many roles that folks can play. We have had policy interns. We have had folks help us with outreach. We have had universities start their own ACLU club, which we partner with the students to help bring speakers and organize on the campus. We take legal interns, and additionally, we call on folks to actually go to the council and testify on bills. And if that is something that folks are interested in, we do Know Your Rights presentations for folks, walk you through citizen lobbying. We will work with people to help them craft their testimony. So there are lots of ways that folks can get involved here locally.
Thank you. And thank you for coming.